Can you believe that it took me less than 5 minutes to cut and sew this pocket tissue holder? It's fast and fun to sew, but how do you make it and how do you customize the size if your tissue packet has a slightly different size? I'll cover it all in this tutorial. For this project I'm using cotton, but linen is a nice option too. You only need a small piece of fabric, so it's great for using up some pretty scraps. If your pocket tissues have a different size or if you have the mini tissues, then I'll show you how to make a custom size at the end of the video. The short sides are going to form the opening later on, but first we need to finish the raw edges. So we'll start by folding them in by 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch, press them and then fold them in again. After you've done that first fold, you can use it as a guide to do the second fold. Give it a nice press and repeat the steps on the other side. Now it's always nice to have a ruler handy. Most of the times I just eyeball these centimeter seams. I've been sewing for about 20 years and I've done them so many times that most of the times I get close enough. After pressing, I'm going to sew really close to the folded edge. And as you can see, I'm working on the wrong side of the project. That way I can see where the edge is. To get a nice straight stitch line, I align the edge of the folded fabric to the gap in the presser foot, and then I offset the needle position slightly to the right. Repeat the step for the other side, then snip the thread tails and prep for the French seam. To create the overlap, we need to find the center of the piece of fabric. So fold it in half and then press in a little crease. Now we're going to use those creases to create the overlap and opening of the pouch. I'm using a couple of pins so that I can see where the center is once I've folded over the edges. Each side needs to overlap the pin by 1 centimeter, and I'm not going to measure it, I'm just going to use a little ridge on the back as a guide. Now it's really important in this step that you have the right side of the fabric on the outside and the wrong side of the fabric on the inside, because we're sewing a French seam, so that means we're going to do a second line of stitches later on. And that second line of stitches will encase the raw edges of the fabric. I'm going to use a couple of pins to keep everything in place, and then I'm going to sew the first line of stitches for the French seam at 1 centimeter from the raw edge. Now we need to trim the seam allowance by about half. No need to measure this, you can just eyeball it. For the final step, we need to turn the little pouch inside out. I'm going to use my trusty bamboo turner to poke out the points. Now, it's always a good idea to take your time to poke out the corners and to press everything, but especially with French seams, because if you don't pay attention, you might have the raw edges of your seam allowance poking out on the right side of your project. And for the final line of stitches, you want the wrong side of the fabric facing you, and you need to sew at 1 centimeter from the edge. After you turn the project right side out and poke out the corners, it's ready for a packet of tissues. To create a custom template, you need to measure the tissue packet. The yellow line is measured around the packet, so that's the width and the thickness. And then the pink line is half of the packet, the length plus the thickness. In my case, that gives me a rectangle 13 centimeters by 15 centimeters. And then we need to add the seam allowances on top of that. I've added 2 centimeters to the top and bottom for the French seam. Then I added a centimeter for the overlap on both sides and 2 centimeters for the double fold edge on both sides. When everything's added up, you end up with a rectangle that's 19 by 17 centimeters. Now, if you have, for example, a smaller packet, then you need to do the exact same steps. So you need to measure the packet and then measure around it. That's the yellow line, and then measure half the length of the package, so that's the bottom and the length, and that's the pink line. And then on top of that, you're going to add your seam allowances, and you'll end up with a custom size tissue holder. To test this formula, I didn't have like the mini tissue package, but I did have a sponge to try it out on, and as you can see, I've used the exact same formula and it works for a smaller size too.